Welcome back to our second day of our virtual conference, and we'd love to thank everybody who presented yesterday. Some of you are back for day 2, either as presenters or participants, and we thank you for joining us again. Thank you again to our corporate partners. Their engagement in our schools and with Cal-ISBOA provides resources, both knowledge and financial, that enables the association to support you and helps to bring us all together to share information and solutions. A quick note, the election for the Cal-ISBOA Board of Directors is now underway. Each member school receives 1 ballot. You will have received the information via email yesterday. It's sent to the main membership contact at each school. So check your email if you're that contact. And if you don't see it, check your spam folder. And if you're uncertain who that person is at your school, please reach out to me and I will let you know. And finally, a big thank you to our planning committee. They work hard all year long to develop topics and identify resources, which we think make these sessions especially relevant. Especially this year, that was a lot to ask of people and it was kind of a moving target, but it's a lot of fun. And if anybody's interested in volunteering for that role, let us know. We hope that the conference is really the start of some important conversations with your colleagues here and at your schools. One of the things that we've learned this year is that nothing replaces conversations and sharing information with your colleagues, either via the listserv, via roundtables, and in areas like this. And we look forward in the coming year to getting back to having at least some, maybe just small gatherings in person where we can actually continue developing these thoughts that we've identified here. Developing the ability to have these conversations is critical to the strength of your schools. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Deb Dowling, who will talk about how we can contribute to having a healthy exchange of ideas with a variety of constituencies within our communities. Dr. Dowling is the Executive Director of CAAS. Deb was previously the Assistant Head of School at Chadwick School. She also held positions at Bridges Academy and Harvard Westlake. She's originally from Melbourne, Australia. Deb holds a bachelor's degree in physics and a doctorate in the history and philosophy of science. She has taught a variety of subjects from kindergarten through undergraduate, including leadership training for independent school administrators. And it is now my pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Deborah Dowling.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martha. I am sharing my screen so that I can walk you through a slideshow, which is going to be quite different from the keynote that you heard yesterday. Yesterday's keynote was the exciting big picture. It was, where do we go from here? What's the context? Mine is going to be all the way narrowed in, kind of to the level of what do I do on Tuesday? I'm going to be talking about much more specific sorts of things. So in an effort to not sort of overlap with Ari and get into that big picture stuff, I thought, what can I bring that's useful and may not be what people are already getting in this conference? So one of the things that I've done in my past was I have been a trainer of teachers, teaching teachers how to teach, particularly science and math teachers. And the principles that science and math teachers use to teach kids ideas that are unfamiliar to them, I actually use them in all sorts of contexts. And I think that they can be really useful for people like you who work with technical information when you are talking with people who may not be so comfortable with technical information. So my presentation is about communicating beyond the business office. It's about The people that you talk to who are not necessarily in your field, the head of school and the senior administration, the board of trustees, the families, the faculty and staff. There are all sorts of conversations that business folks need to have with people in all of those categories. And in each case, I'm sure that you already do think hard about, what does this person or group need to know? Why do they need to know it? What level of financial background can I assume? What words will be familiar and what acronyms will they wonder what I'm talking about? How do I get their attention? And do they understand what I'm saying? So I'm sure that you guys already do this very well. But what I'd like to do is bring some techniques from the field of teaching to show you some models that might be useful for when the conversations get complicated or difficult. I'm going to do it at 3 levels, and this is going to be a highly condensed presentation, because essentially what I'm going to do is do the training that I would do for beginning teachers who are new to the field. And then with real teachers, I would imagine that they would go off and practice it for a few months, and then they would come back and we would do the next level of training for lesson planning in a more complex way. And then they would go off and do that for a while, and then they'd come back a few months later and we'd do the 3rd level of, well, how do you deal with really difficult topics? And so I'm going to try and cram all 3 levels into this very short presentation. So it's more like reading you the contents chapter of a textbook than actually teaching it to you. But I hope that by naming the strategies, you'll be able to take something away, which will make an upcoming difficult conversation more manageable. And so before I start leaping into it, I'm going to take you through some examples of conversations that you may be having, in the hope that you will think of something that you're not looking forward to in the next 6 months to a year, maybe in the next 3 hours, I don't know. But thinking about a conversation with someone outside the business office where it might be useful to have some extra tools and strategies. So let's take a quick look at some examples of the sorts of conversations that I'm talking about. There are conversations with the senior administration and the head of school about how our income is spent, how strong are our finances, how strong are our policies, how can we improve fiscally. There are conversations with faculty and staff about nuts and bolts of their compensation. Sometimes there are department chairs who are managing a budget for the first time and need some guidance. Sometimes there are teachers who really are interested in the big picture of school finances, or you'd like them to be more interested in the big picture of school finances, especially the ones who are saying, well, can't we just pay for that? We're rich. There are conversations with the board of trustees, and sometimes these are much more formal with slideshows and so forth. And they can be about your investments. They could be with committees. They could be with the whole board. It could be, can we afford a new building? And then there are the families. And again, they will sometimes have sort of nuts and boltsy questions about paying for their fees and so forth. They may have questions as donors about how their money affects the school. They may have big picture questions about why are we charging fees, those sorts of things. These I think of as the typical questions that the business office needs to be able to address with people who are outside of the field of business management. There are also some really tough questions, and this is what I'll get to in that level 3 stage, which is, how do you have the conversations when emotion is getting in the way? Already, if you're a technical person talking to a non-technical person, you often have to get past the emotion of, oh, I'm not a math person, this is scary, that's a spreadsheet, I don't like spreadsheets, those sorts of things. But sometimes the emotion is much more visceral. Sometimes you need to talk to someone, maybe it's the school head, and you need to let them know that there is a big financial problem. Sometimes you might need to talk to a new department chair and say, or possibly an experienced department chair, and say, you really should not have spent school money on that. You might need to talk to a family whose fees are overdue. You might need to talk to the board of trustees about something that's going to make them pretty unhappy. So these are the hard conversations. These are the ones I'm going to get to in level 3. So I'm hoping that each of you has been using these examples as a kind of springboard to think about conversations that you're going to be having yourself in the next however long, where some extra tools could be useful. So let's start with level 1. And I know that there are some teachers in this audience, and I thank you for your patience. But this is what I would take a group of very new teachers through. One key point, which improves everybody's teaching, and some practical tips for how to apply it. So when a teacher plans a lesson, an inexperienced teacher thinks, what am I going to do up at the front of the classroom? I'm going to tell them this. I'm going to show them that. I'm going to provide this handout. The experienced teacher frames that same conversation inside their head as, what is the student going to do? When you're planning a lesson like this, you're thinking the student is going to hear this rather than I'm going to say that. The student is going to see this rather than I'm going to show them that. And the student is going to experience this, is going to receive this. And it sounds like you're doing exactly the same thing, just in different words, but it's actually a gestalt shift that lets you see much more detail about how the audience's brain is working. Because once you start thinking in terms of their experience, you can start to get a more sophisticated understanding of what they need and how the things that you provide are going to move them forward to where you want them to be. So that focus on the students' brains is a great sort of first lesson for an incoming teacher. And if I bring that into conversations about business with people outside the business office, it's no longer about students, it's about usually adults, but with whom you need to talk about technical stuff. Whether it's typical communications or those difficult emotional ones, if you are focusing on what's happening in their brain rather than what you're going to say, then you should start with what's the main thing that they should take away? What state do you want their brain to be in when they walk away from this experience, this contact with you? And once you've established what it is that you want to achieve through this conversation, then you can start thinking about how to make the cogs in their brain turn so that the point that you're making is going to be obvious to them. You can think about what information is going to help them to get ready to understand the main point. Again, you're not thinking about what do I want to tell them, what do I think is important. You're thinking, what do they need to know? And in order to get to that place, what background are they going to need to have first? And you're also going to be thinking about what will hold their attention. Because when you're dealing with getting people's brains to from their current state to where you want them to be, you have to deal with the simple human frailty of people lose track of the conversation. They get distracted. And so thinking about how to hold their attention is important as well. And in typical communications, these things are important steps to go through. In difficult conversations, you have to also address the emotion. You need to think about how is this main point going to make them feel? And what's going to prepare them not to absorb this intellectual set of facts, but what's going to prepare them to being emotionally ready to listen to what you have to say? And what's going to help them feel ready to act on what you have to say in a positive way and do what it is that you need them to do as a result of this hard conversation? So this is the mindset shift from there's a conversation coming up, here's what I'm going to do and say, to there's a conversation coming up, here is what I want the other person to experience, because that's going to affect their minds to the point where they get to the place I want them to be when they leave. Now, different conversations happen in different media, and there are some little tips and tricks that I'm sure most of you are already very familiar with for making sure that you hit the right tone and you get across the things that you want to get across. For example, if you are sending an email, make it short. The less you write, the more they'll read. Sometimes humor works. I used to be the person in charge of telling everybody they had to do their mandatory training in like sexual harassment and fire hydrant extinguisher use and things like that. And the best way to get people to actually read that email and respond and maybe even do their online training was to just pack that email with jokes. It was quite successful, as much as you can be in that situation. If you're sharing a document, make sure it's not packed full of words. Again, the less you write, the more they'll read, but also with a document, you can put in graphics. You can use headings to structure things, and you can make your language nice and concise. If you're explaining something to a person one-on-one, here is an old teacher's cliche. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them. Then tell them what you told them, and then follow up with an email. It's a very effective way of making sure that you get through to someone. And you may notice when I started this presentation, I started out by telling you what I was going to tell you. Now I'm telling it to you. And at the end, I'll tell you what I told you. I probably won't follow up with an email though. If you're presenting in a meeting, you need to prepare so that you can get right to the point, because in a meeting, nobody will listen if you waffle. It's a good idea to provide handouts so that people can refer back and look at the numbers and so forth. But also be really clear in a meeting about what the audience's role is. Because if you're not clear about whether they're there to listen or to advise or to make a decision, they're going to jump to their own conclusions about that, and they may interact in ways that just aren't helpful at all. So when you're presenting in a meeting, that's a really useful trick or tip. And when you're presenting to a big audience, it's a good idea to start with why something matters to the audience, because that's going to help them pay attention and realize that this is important. It's a good idea to keep your points short and simple. 1 to 3 main points is enough, and summarize them at the end. And just like with a document, use big, clear graphics. So this is my kind of level 1 presentation for the beginning teacher. And the key point is, don't focus on what you're going to do in the conversation. Focus on what they're going to experience in the conversation and how that's going to get them to the place you want to go. If you're ready for level 2, I will now take you into a strategy called understanding by design, which is probably the most influential lesson planning technique of the past 20 years. It's a very useful way of planning a physics lesson or a math lesson or even a history lesson, but it's also a very useful way of planning a conversation, especially a conversation which may be technical with someone who may not have a technical background. There are 3 key steps in this lesson planning technique, and I'm going to show you the 3 steps, and then I'm going to walk you through 3 examples. First of all, there we go. The first step is decide what the student should know or be able to do as a result of the lesson. Secondly, and this is actually quite tricky, think about what evidence would show you that it's been successful. Now, for a teacher, that's easy. You give them a test. But there's probably more subtle ways of finding out too, if they have successfully learned what they need to learn. In a conversation, it's usually about how are they responding to your questions? What's the expression on their face? Those sorts of things. And then you get to the complicated part that we've just started talking about what experiences in the mind of the person are going to get them ready to provide you that evidence that they have achieved what it is that you want them to achieve. So if we translate this away from teaching a lesson and into having a conversation, it's almost exactly the same. What should the person you're talking with know or be able to do as a result of the conversation? Secondly, what evidence would show you that they have successfully gained this out of the conversation? And then the third one, as you're planning, is what experiences do you want to put them through so that they will be in a position to show you that evidence? Let's look at some examples. Here is a finance committee choosing between loan types. So what should they know or be able to do? Well, maybe you've got three options and you want the finance committee to be able to recognize the pros and cons of each of the three options. And your finance committee may have experts and it may have complete newbies, and you've got to get all of them to that place. What evidence would show that the finance committee has understood the pros and cons of the three options? Well, that's probably going to show up in the kinds of questions they ask and the kinds of opinions that they express, because you'll notice, if it's worked, that their input is actually referring back to those key differentiating factors between the three options. So, what experiences should you put that group through in order to get them to a place where their input will be appropriate? Well, you can give them colored charts. You can have them hear you explain some stuff. You can refer them to a table which has the key points. You can give them the opportunity to ask questions. There's a bunch of experiences they can have. Now, the visuals help. For example, if you can lay things out really clearly, that's going to help them have those experiences which make things obvious to them. And sometimes diminishing the amount of information so that just the key concept is visible. For example, between three different loan options that are structured differently over time, something like this can be an experience inside the brain of the person you're talking to, which gets them to a place where their input is going to come back to those main points. So that was the first example. Here's another example. Let's say you have to give a presentation to some parents about how tuition is set. Well, by the end of the presentation, you want them to know that the school's tuition is normal. You guys are not crazy. And you want them to know the main costs that drive the budget. You will be able to tell it's worked if their questions show that they understand the context of tuition. So they're asking non-crazy questions which refer back to what you said and kind of make sense. And to get them to a place where they can do this, you might want to show them a chart of relative tuitions. You might want them to hear people talking about the priorities that the school has in terms of setting salaries for employees. You might want them to get out a pencil and paper and actually calculate the gap between income from fees and expenses. If it's a Zoom, you might want them to be able to ask questions as you go along. All of these are experiences that can happen inside the minds of the parents, which will hopefully lead them to a place where their questions will show that they've understood the point. So you might want to show them a really simple chart, or this kind of chart I've seen often. And sometimes leaving out the numbers and the details and the words is key, just so that you can get to the main points. So the third example, let's say that a new head has come into your school, someone with no background in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or finance, and it's their first budget cycle. And as the business officer, you need to sit down with them and help them to read profit and loss sheets and balance sheets for the very first time. You need them to help them understand the structures of budgets and sub-budgets in your school. You need them to be able to compare the income and expenditure from year to year to see what the trends are. And you're going to be able to tell if it's working by having them talk back to you with questions and here's what I see, and here's a suggestion I have for next year, those sorts of things. When you listen to their feedback and their input, it should reflect that they know and understand those things. At least in time, that should improve. And so they need to experience hearing you talk, but that's only the beginning. They need to try and explain it back to you. That's a really crucial experience for a lot of people to have when they're learning. They need to be able to find things in the documents themselves. And that means you not showing them, but giving them time to go look. They need to be able to look through a bunch of data and tell you what they find surprising rather than having you point it out. So there's a bunch of experiences that you can take them through. And all of the time, you will be watching for the evidence in their behavior and their speech, which shows whether they need more experiences before they've reached the goal or whether they're already there. So these three examples are all about how you start with, what do you want to get out of this? How will I know if it's working? And what experiences need to happen in their head to get them to a place where they can show me it's working? So now I think we're ready. If we can pretend that you as teachers have gone off and practiced that in the classroom for a bit, let's get into the really hard conversations. So this is when you are dealing with conversations where emotion is really getting in the way of the conversation. Now, for a teacher, this happens more often with humanities classes, but it can also happen in science and technology classes, in math classes, when there are kids who are afraid of the math or just got a bad grade on their test, or there's stuff going on at home which they're bringing their baggage into the classroom. There are all sorts of situations where emotions are playing into the stuff happening inside of their heads. And if you don't understand that and you can't navigate it, you won't be able to get to the intellectual side of the learning. And I know as business officers, you get quite a few of those things that you have to deal with in all of your constituencies. So the difference in the approach is subtle. You still have the same 3 steps. What do you want to get out of this? Notice though the words have changed to include be ready to do, because emotions sometimes stop people from being ready to move forward. Just like in the previous stage, we're looking for what evidence will show us that this worked. But in the third stage, when we were dealing with more intellectual topics, it was what experiences will prepare them to be in an intellectual state where they can show you they get this, that they understand it and they know it. In this situation, we need to think about the experiences that will prepare them to engage effectively so that they can then move into the intellectual side of understanding the content of what you're trying to say. So this is level 3. This is getting past the what's happening in their heads rather than what am I saying. It's getting past the what do I want them to know on an intellectual level, and thinking about how do I get them ready to hear what's being said. Here's an example, and I've just got 2 examples of this. The first one is about telling a parent that they need to pay their tuition or they need to leave. Now, hopefully it won't be you who has to have that conversation, but sometimes it will. You never know. Now, it's not too hard to answer the question of what should they know or be ready to do as a result of this conversation, because they should be ready to either pay up or move on. The evidence that will show you that the conversation was successful is that they will pay their money or they will move on. But the hard bit is, how do you get them there? So let's start thinking about what you need to get past in terms of what's happening inside of their head that may get in the way of intellectually grasping that they need to either pay their tuition or move along. Because there is so much going on in the head of the parent in this situation. If they believe that you don't respect them, it's going to be very hard for them to listen to what you have to say. If they believe that you're kicking them out and their child is going to be horribly unhappy and won't get the qualifications they need to go on and become successful, if they're in that kind of protect my baby from the saber-toothed tiger mode, they're not going to hear what you have to say. It's important to think about, how is this conversation affecting not just the emotions, but also the sense of identity? Are you telling me I'm a bad person? Am I the kind of person who can't pay my bills? All of this identity stuff can really affect a person's willingness to listen. And I don't mean intellectual willingness, I mean emotional readiness. Sometimes there's other stuff going on at home. You may not know about that, but it may also get in the way. So at this point, I'm going to step aside from the traditional teacher training and more into the leadership training of how do you have these very difficult emotional conversations. There's a great book on this, which I'm going to recommend at the end of the presentation, but it suggests these 5 steps. The 3 on the left are about addressing all of those things in the person's head that are getting in the way. And then once you've addressed those, then you're free to address the things that are on the right and make sure that you get the content through. So it's important to frame the conversation, acknowledge it's hard, show your sympathy. It's essential to listen. If you don't ostentatiously listen to the other person, they're much less likely to listen to you. That's a good time after you've listened to reassure them. Say, this is what I heard that you seem to be concerned about. I'd like to really assure you that, whatever it is, that's going to help them be ready to hear. And when they start to relax, which I hope they will, after you've listened to them, after you've reassured them, then you need to be really clear, because the temptation is, if you've got bad news, to hide it in obfuscation, in vagueness, in lots of positivity surrounding the negativity. But you've got to make sure that your message gets through. And you've got to ensure that they heard you by listening to their feedback. And then afterwards, you've got to follow up. At the end of the meeting, I always say, here is what's going to happen next. And then following up with an email that says, thank you for this great meeting. Here is what I heard in the conversation. Please let me know if I've missed anything or misunderstood anything. And here is what's going to happen next. Because if you take that approach, then you can start out by giving them information which is going to help calm those fears and those emotions. And once you can share that, then you'll be in a better position to do what's on the lower part of this screen, which is the informational content. I've got a second example of the same thing. And this is a less personal one, but it can get just as emotional in some situations. If you have a finance committee, for example, or a facilities committee in this example, which is very attached to a particular building project, but there's some bad news financially and you have to deliver it to them, that's going to be hard. You know the content of what they should know at the end of the communication. You know that they should be ready to approve the plan that you're suggesting, which is the alternative, or else come up with a better one. But they definitely need to be ready to move past their old beliefs and expectations. And you hope that they will actually start doing that, and thus you'll see that you've been successful in the communication. But how do you actually get there? You've got to think about, what are the barriers that might be getting in the way of processing the information that you're sharing? There's emotion, there's grief, there's loss. There's also the sense of identity. Will this affect our credibility and our reputation? You know, did we make a terrible mistake that we should be embarrassed about or ashamed of? Is someone going to blame me? Or can I blame someone else? All of these things can be negative emotions that get in the way of listening to the content of what someone's trying to say. So if you start by, remember, first of all, say this is going to be hard, frame the conversation so they know it's coming. Then listen to them and show that you've listened. Now, that may not mean that you set aside time in the meeting for them to emote before you get to the point. It might be, at our last meeting, this is what I heard from you. It might be, I'm aware from all of our previous conversations that these are your top priorities, but some kind of signaling that you listen to them will make it much more likely that they'll listen to you. And then reassuring them that the things that are creating those emotional barriers that they're really worrying about, those sorts of things, if you can provide assurances that that's going to be okay, then it'll be much easier for them to start listening to alternatives. So what I've just done is dragged you through 3 levels of teacher training in the context not of actually working with a class, but in the context of having a technical conversation with people who may not be technical themselves. And in all of these situations, planning is essential. And the harder you expect the conversation to be, the more you need to plan it and script it and maybe even practice it. The first thing to plan is, what do you want the person to walk away from this with in their mind? That is, they're currently in this mental state. What's the mental state you want them to get to by the time they leave this conversation? And then the next question is, once you know your goal, how will you know if you're successfully getting them to that point? So what will you be watching for in their responses? And then you need to think about how their experiences are going to get them from point A to point B, and what experiences can you provide in the conversation by talking, by showing them things, by asking them to do things, by asking them to figure stuff out. What experiences are going to get them from A to B? And because you're focusing on their mind, not on your actions, you'll probably be sensitized to the need to be concise and clear, to use words and images and keep things as simple as possible. Just go for the main point, to tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then do what I'm doing right now, which is telling them what you told them. Those were my main points. These are some resources that I wanted to share with you. Difficult Conversations by Stone is a really good book about how to have that third level conversation, the ones where it's really emotional. If you've got some hard ones of those coming up, I strongly recommend getting hold of this book and just sort of having a read about it. Understanding by Design is the textbook for teachers. That's the one about figure out what they need to know by the time they leave your classroom. Think about how you're going to know if they have got there, and then design experiences that will take the kids through a process at the end of which they're ready to show you what you need to see in terms of that evidence that they got there. So that's just a useful metaphorical resource. And then I put the last one in just because I love it. It's a really old TED Talk, and it's an example of how visualization of data can make it so much easier to understand. And I go back and watch it every now and then just as a reminder of the value of graphic presentation of technical data when you're explaining something to someone which is kind of technical. As a physics teacher, I found that particular TED Talk inspiring, and I still do. So I think we are about out of time. We have 2 minutes left. And I see a question in the chat about, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? And the answer is yes. So I believe that Martha has the PowerPoint. And Martha, I think it's time to hand it back over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Deb. We're so happy that you could be with us this afternoon. It's been quite a first year for you. You came into CAAS. Deb started with CAAS on July 1st. So she's had quite a first year, and it's actually been quite a nice partnership between the two of us and sharing resources and information. So that's been really, really a great help during this time. I can think of a number of difficult conversations that we've been having this past year, and that we'll continue to have. And I particularly found it interesting, and I know this is a small thing, but to take the numbers out of the charts. One of the things I know that we talk a lot about is not having, keeping board and committee out of the weeds. And by providing them with the weeds, you're inviting them in. And so if you keep it at the level that you want to stay at, you don't have to backtrack or take things away or have the stress of getting them to change their orientation in the middle of a conversation. So thank you. I'm going to use some of that in my next board meeting. Anyway, the rest of the afternoon, let's talk about that. So we're going to have a 15-minute break, and then we will have a round of breakout sessions. I think by now most people here know how to get into the breakout sessions through the website. And there are links posted on the website. So those will be in 15 minutes. And then there'll be another 15-minute break after that. And then we're going to exhaust you by having you listen to Michael Blatcher and getting a legal update, which we always know is a marathon session, fortunately, with plenty of humor. So I will see you all back once we get together at 3:15. And in the meantime, please join us for a breakout session. Thank you.